Jesus, my Lord, will love me forever. From him no power of evil can sever. He gave his life to ransom my soul. Now I belong to him. Now I belong to Jesus. Jesus belongs to me. Not for the years of time alone, but for eternity. Once I was lost in sin's degradation. Jesus came down to bring me salvation, lifted me up from sorrow and shame. Now I belong to him. Now I belong to Jesus. Jesus belongs to me. Not for the years of time alone, but for eternity. Joy floods my soul, for Jesus has saved me, freed me from sin that long had enslaved me. His precious blood he gave to redeem. Now I belong to him. Now I belong to Jesus. Jesus belongs to me. Not for the years of time alone, but for eternity. All right, thank you for that great singing. You may be seated.
All right, well, good evening, if you would. Make sure I'm not muted, Brother Josh. I should be on. It's all right. We got a substitute sound guy tonight. All right, thank you very much. All right, if you would open your Bibles to Romans chapter number 1. And last week we had an introduction and looked at the first several verses here of Romans. And today we're going to pick up where we left off. And of course, if you remember, most of you probably are aware, the book of Romans is a letter written by the Apostle Paul to the believers that were in Rome. And we talked about this last week, but he said there in verse number 7, it says, "To all that be in Rome, beloved of God, called to be saints." He's talking to believers, and that's important because what he's saying is for believers. There are certain truths that are true for believers that not others. What's the song we just sang? Now I belong to Jesus. Who can say that? Believers. How do I belong to Jesus? How did that happen? I believed in him. I trusted him. That's it. There's nothing else. There's nothing special about me. It wasn't because I have hair and Brother Chad doesn't, right? Or Brother Paul doesn't, or Brother Steve. Man, I'm outnumbered, actually. I better stop counting. It's not because I'm the color of my skin. It's not because of my gender. It's not because of the place I was born. It's because I believed. And we're going to look at that tonight specifically. And so the Apostle Paul is writing to these people. And we talked about that, who he's writing to, and kind of the purpose. But in verses 8 down through verse number 17, he kind of lays out in the beginning of this letter his reason for writing. And so that's why, there's people who have spent a lot of time, a lot of effort trying to put together all of the different things from this book. They've written entire books that are much longer than this book itself about this book, when all you really have to do is read it and study it. And Paul doesn't say anything in a way that's super confusing or that doesn't make sense. He's not writing in riddles. He's writing clearly. And so he spells out why he wrote this letter. And he wasn't writing a book of theology. He's writing a letter. I'm writing to you to teach you something. And so I think there's a lot of things in this book that are easy to be understood. And he tells us what it is, the purpose of it, here in the first part of this book. And so we're going to go ahead and read through this and point these things out. He says, first, in verse 8, "I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, that your faith is spoken of throughout the whole world. For God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit in the gospel of his Son, that without ceasing I make mention of you always in my prayers, making request, if by any means now at length I might have a prosperous journey by the will of God to come unto you. For I long to see you, that I may impart unto you some spiritual gift, to the end ye may be established. That is, that I may be comforted together with you by the mutual faith both of you and me. Now I would not have you ignorant, brethren, that oftentimes I purposed to come unto you, but was let hitherto, that I might have some fruit among you also, even as among other Gentiles. I'm debtor both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the unwise. So as much as in me is, I am ready to preach the gospel to you that are in Rome also. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed, from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. And so there's a lot of things that Paul says there, but you can basically sum up, here's his reason for writing the letter. Why did he write it? One, he says this, it says, I thank my God through Christ Jesus, or Jesus Christ, for you all. He says this in verse 10, making a request, if by any means, now at length, I might have a prosperous journey by the will of God to come unto you, for I long to see you. One thing that he's writing is this, to tell them, I want to come and to see you. Talking about the believers that are there, but I think also he wants to go to Rome to make more believers. But that's part of the reason he wrote, is because he's desired for a while to go there and he couldn't. He was let hitherto, and the word let there, as somebody pointed out in our little Bible study together, was that word let doesn't mean allow. It actually kind of means the opposite. It means he was held back. He wanted to go, but God wouldn't let him. You know, there's a lot of things in our life that maybe we want to do, and for some reason we can't. You ever feel like you're kind of hitting your head against the wall? I want to do this. I want to accomplish it, and yet you can't. I think sometimes God doesn't want you to yet. You think about the Apostle Paul. He wanted to go to Rome. He wanted to go to Rome on his way to Spain. And yet he said, I haven't been able to yet, but I'm going to. And you know, when Paul wrote this, he was on his way down to Jerusalem, and eventually he's going to go to Rome. We know that he goes to Rome, but he doesn't go the way that he planned to go to Rome. You know, sometimes you pray for something and you get it, but not the way that you wanted it. You got to be careful what you pray for, I think. He wanted to go to Rome, and he goes as a prisoner. And you think, there's things that I want to accomplish, but I don't know that I want to accomplish them that way, right? I'd love to meet the president, but I don't want it to be so that he can pardon me, right, from a life sentence or something. I don't want to meet famous people because of that reason. I don't want to go places because of that. But look at the way Paul thought about this. You know, he inevitably went to Rome. He went as a prisoner. And he wrote the book of Philippians from Rome. And he said in chapter 1 of Philippians, verses 12 to 13, But I would ye should understand, brethren, that the things which happened unto me have fallen out rather unto the furtherance of the gospel, so that my bonds in Christ are manifest in all the palace and in all other places. Because Paul went to Rome as a prisoner, he had a podium in places that he wouldn't have if he'd gone his own way. If he had just taken a trip to Rome, he probably wouldn't have been in the palace. He probably wouldn't have gotten to speak to the people that he did. I mean, he may have. But because he went as a prisoner, there are certain doors that were opened that wouldn't have been otherwise. And so he was able to reach farther and greater because he was a prisoner. Isn't that backwards? If you're a prisoner, you think that your reach is cut off. You're shut off. I can't do anything. I'm behind bars. And yet Paul, as a prisoner, he's writing letters to churches. He said, because of my bonds, the gospel is going farther than it's ever gone before. It's going to places it has never gone before. And you have to ask the question, how did that happen in Paul's life? And I think you have to also ask the question, do I want that to happen in my life? Do I want to have that kind of an impact where no matter what I'm doing, the gospel is coming out? The gospel is going forward. I could be arrested and thrown in jail, and yet it doesn't stop me. You know, when we were going through COVID, there were pastors that were standing up, and I think particularly in Canada, where they were like arresting people and blocking off churches and things. I think this, if a pastor truly was standing for God and got thrown in jail, he'd have a better reach than if he stayed at home and didn't do it. And I think that if you're standing for God and adversity comes, God's going to use it, and there's a reason for it. And I don't think Paul ever was looking for trouble. I think he was just looking to do what was right. And when trouble came, he just kept doing it. And that's almost foreign in our country today. It's almost foreign to keep fighting. And I'm glad to see, in America, it seems like I was texting with somebody the other day, and I didn't really watch any of the inauguration or any of that stuff. I kind of saw some clips, but somebody said it feels like we're in America again. What makes America America? I think it's because we fight, right? We fight for what we believe in, and I think as Christians we're supposed to stand for what we believe in, and those are the two things that make, if America is great, it's because it's Christian, and what makes you a Christian is that you stand for what you believe in. And I think if this country's ever going to feel like we want it to feel, it's because we stand for something, right? As Americans, we stand for something. If you don't stand for anything, you just get pushed around, then man, I don't want to live in a future that's like that. I don't want my kids to grow up in a future where nobody wants to stand for anything. And so it starts with us. We were talking in our group before, I don't even know how we got on this subject, but there's certain things that have changed in our lifetime. And for some of you, those things have changed a lot more than in say, my lifetime or some of these teenagers' lifetime. But there's lots of things that have changed. There was a time when you couldn't go out to eat on Sunday because everything was closed. You couldn't go to the store on Sunday. Why did that change? I think it's because at some point somebody said, yeah, I guess I'd miss church to go do that. I guess I would stay home to go do that. Somebody made that decision, and it got made again and again. I think Brother Larry and I were having this conversation that's one of the things that has changed our country is the fact that Sunday nobody cares about anymore. It is not a special day, and it was. Doesn't mean that our country was perfect before, but at least that was something. And somebody made a decision. So how do we change it? I can't go to the president and say, I want you to sign an executive order that says nobody can be open on Sundays. That's not going to work. But I think we do the things like Chick-fil-A, and we just say, I'm not open today. I'm not going to do it, right? I'm not going to go to work on Sunday. I'm not going to do those things. I'm going to make a difference. And whether it changes the world or not, at least I'm going to do what is right. And so that's the stand I think we ought to be willing to make, because you see that the Apostle Paul made those kind of stands. Throughout his life, he made these stands, and what did it produce? I mean, he got himself almost killed. He got himself in trouble. But the gospel went farther than it had ever gone before because of him just not bending a knee. So he's telling these people in Rome, people who he'd never met, he did not know, I've longed to come and see you. But because I can't, I'm going to write you this letter. He writes in verse 11, for I long to see you. I want to come and see you. That word long means I have a great desire to come and to see you. You ever thought about meeting people you've never met before and just thought, I just want to come and see you? The Apostle Paul had a great gift, right? He had a gift for preaching. God chose him to be an apostle. That's what he says in verse 1. Called to be an apostle. God chose him to preach the gospel and to teach this truth. And I think Paul understood, I've got an assignment and I'm going to do it. And so that means this. There's people in Rome, I need to get to them because I've got a job to do. The truth is that you and I also have a job to do. I'm not the Apostle Paul, right? I think he was a guy that was probably very intense to be around. Just, ready to tell you what he thought, not afraid of anything. I'm not that same guy, but I still have a job to do. And I still know this, I'm supposed to be doing it. And there are people in the world that I don't know that probably I ought to long to want to share the gospel with, but I don't. That's the difference. The Apostle Paul longed to keep doing what he was called to do. And I think maybe the reason if we don't accomplish God's will at a high level, maybe I just don't want it as bad. You ever watch a basketball game and the better team lost? Because they didn't want it as bad. Or the better team lost. If you have kids playing sports, sometimes you can look and say, you guys didn't want it as bad, right? Or whatever it is. But you and I, if we're going to accomplish, the only thing that stands in the way from you doing what God wants you to do is you. Right? I belong to who? Jesus. You think he's going to not let me do what he wants me to do? You think he's going to let somebody else stand in my way of doing what he wants you to do? No. He's going to let me choose whether I'm going to do it or not. And so the Apostle Paul did it. He said, I desire to come, and for what reason? That I may impart unto you some spiritual gift to the end you may be established. He knew this. He had a spiritual gift. You and I have a spiritual gift. You think about it, the gospel is a gift. It is the gift of God. It is the power of God unto salvation. How are we saved? How did you get saved if you're saved this morning? Somebody gave you the gift of the gospel. And that was given to you not so that you can hold on to it, but so you could take it. You can give it to somebody else. We could share it. He said, I want to impart to you a spiritual gift. It's not that he wants to give them a miracle. Some people take it to mean this. He wants to give them some kind of miracle. But rather it's this. It's not necessarily a supernatural gift. It's a spiritual gift. And I think this, he wants to teach them spiritual truths because he says it's to the end ye may be established. And that's the goal, that they would be established, meaning they'd be firmly planted in what they believe. It's hard to imagine living in a world where Christianity is new. But there were Christians all over the known world, from Rome all the way down, Jerusalem, all the way down into Ethiopia to Africa, and all those parts there were Christians, and probably at that time they hadn't yet divided into all these different denominations. Now we know this, there were false teachers, there's people spreading lies, but we were talking about this before, that probably most believers knew who Paul was, because he's writing letters, he's traveling, and if I'm a believer, what am I looking for? Other believers. And if I got a visitor from up in Jerusalem and I'm down in Ethiopia, I'm like, hey, tell me what you know about this Christ, about the gospel. Well, we got this letter from the Apostle Paul. Here's what he said. And you know that we call the translation or the text that we get our Bible translation from, the textus receptus, means the received text. You know that for thousands of years they just kept sending those letters and those notes and those copies of copies to each other. And so the churches at that time, I think, were talking to each other, and I think they had a connection. And I think that they needed to be established, right? They had the shared faith. They had the gospel. What do they need from Paul? Some of them just needed to be established in truth, because he knew this, and he told churches this in the book of Acts. He said that wolves are going to come in among you, and if you're not established, they're going to carry you off. They're going to destroy you. They're going to eat you from the inside out. It's kind of a graphic thing. If you ever watch a documentary about wolves, they're not very polite killers, right? That was weird. Computer just did something. But they don't politely, hey, do you mind if I, cut your head off? Sometimes they don't even kill you quickly. Sometimes they start eating an animal while it's still alive, right? And Paul says that's what false teachers are like. They're like wolves. And I think they do that to churches. They come in to churches that are not established, and they begin to eat them from the inside out. They destroy them. They turn people against each other, and they start tearing stuff apart. And so it's important. I think Paul said, I want those Romans to be established. I want them to be firmly planted so they don't get carried about, so they don't get destroyed. And he says this in verse 12, that is, that I may be comforted together with you by the mutual faith, both of you and me. And that mutual faith, think about this, they had a mutual gospel. But once they're firmly established in the faith, man, now it's a mutual faith. There are people that come to our church, missionaries and preachers, that I feel like we always have a good time when they come, right? We always enjoy spending time around them. We always, there's people that we look forward to, and there's some people that probably I ought to try to see if they'll come and visit us. I was talking with Brother Calhoun earlier today, and he told me that he was having the Dombrowskis, Brother Dombrowski at his church. I thought, man, it'd be good to have them. You know what part of the reason we love them is? Because of our mutual faith. If they didn't believe what we believe, we probably never even would have got to know them. We wouldn't have had a connection with them that we had for so many years. And he knows this, we're going to be comforted together, you and me both, because of this. And that was part of the desire. And the last thing he says is this, verse 13, now I would not have you ignorant, brethren, that oftentimes I purposed to come unto you, but was let hitherto, that I might have some fruit among you also, even as among other Gentiles. He wanted to have fruit among them. In other words, he wanted to produce something among them. You know that as Christians, we're supposed to produce something, right? We've talked about this a lot, and the Bible is full of it. Jesus gave all these parables about when he leaves, and he leaves people behind, what are they supposed to do? Produce something. You remember the parable of the talents? They were supposed to go put the talents to work. It was supposed to produce it. The guy that buried his in the ground, he got nothing because he did nothing with what God left him with. There was also the pounds. The people that had the pounds were supposed to do something with it. And you and I are supposed to produce something. I don't think God's going to look at you and expect to have the same resume as Paul. I don't think he expects the same results, but I think he expects results. Produce something. When you're in school and you're growing up, the teacher looks out on the class, Miss Amanda, she'll tell you this is true, And right, you give a test, you expect the same results, right, for each kid because you've taught them all the same thing. You expect the same. But I think you know this also. Some kids, you know what they're capable of, and you can say, I know that you should have done better. Other ones, you're patting them on the back. Man, you did better than I thought, right? And I think God looking down, I think even greater than that, he knows what he knows what he had planned for us. He knows what we could have done better than ourselves. And the Apostle Paul took it this far. He said this in the next verse. He said, I'm a debtor. I'm debtor both to the Greeks and the barbarians, both to the wise and to the unwise. And he's talking about the Gentiles in general. It's not just the wise Gentiles like the Greeks who studied and were learned and cared about philosophies and religions, but also the barbarians, talking not necessarily about brutes and guys that wore loincloths and stuff, but he's talking about people who necessarily were unlearned or who didn't care about those kind of things. Because I owe a debt just as much to them. Sometimes we think we've got to prove to the intellectuals that we're right. That's what Christianity is. I got to go debate an atheist and prove to him that I'm right. Right? You remember so many years ago, Ken Ham, there was a big debate between Ken Ham and some atheist. That's not what Paul was. Yeah, Bill Nye, right? How could I forget Bill Nye, the science guy? Paul wasn't saying, I want to go to Rome and debate the greatest philosopher that you have. He said, I'm a debtor to everybody. They all deserve the same thing that I have, which is what? The gospel of Jesus Christ. I'm a debtor to them. I owe it to them. And so in verse 15 he says, so as much as in me is, I'm ready to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also. The word ready, specifically there, it talks about this. I'm ready and willing. I know I'm a debtor, and so I know that's what I need to do. When I go to Rome, this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to do it for everybody. Everybody that I come in contact with. Brother Jonathan pointed out in our Bible study, there's a verse where the Apostle Paul basically says, I am clean of all men. In other words, every opportunity I had to give the gospel, I gave it. Right? I don't know that any of us could say that and be honest about it, that I've done every single thing I could. Some of us probably may be a little better than others, and there's no point in comparing those results. But the Apostle Paul was so driven to share the gospel because I think this. He had this mentality, I owe it. What God has done for me. And I don't know, I mean, we're human. What if I'm the Apostle Paul and I spent a good chunk of my life trying to destroy Christianity and God saved me from that? I would feel like I owed people something as well. I would feel like, hey, I've got a gift. It changed my life. I'm going to try to give it to you. Not everybody accepted it. I would say probably most people didn't. It doesn't mean I don't owe it to them to give it to them in some way or another. And so he said, as much as in me is, I'm ready to preach the gospel. And then he goes on to say, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. I'm not ashamed. I'm not unwilling. I think there's kind of in other words, I'm ready and willing. I'm not ashamed. If I was ashamed, I would not be ready and willing. That's all right. You have to answer it and turn on speakerphone. I'm just kidding, Paul. I'll let you. Tell the preacher to speak up. I'm not ashamed. Sometimes we have things to be ashamed of. I'm just kidding. But I wonder if during the time that Paul was alive, if there was a lot of shame to stand up in Rome and to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. You're talking about a center for different religions, for different philosophies, for different ideas, and to stand up and say, hey, here's what the truth is. I think there are a lot of people that probably were believers that maybe were not quite ready to stand up and say something. They're a little bit ashamed. I think the times that you and I are not ready and willing to stand up and say something, if we're honest, we're ashamed, right? If somebody stood up and insulted my wife, I would stand up and say, no, you're not going to do that. You know what happens if I don't? I'm ashamed. And I deserved whatever I got, when I got home from that. She'd punch me. But I'm not ashamed. Nobody in here, if you're married, nobody's ashamed to stand up for your wife, are you? Nobody's ashamed to stand up for your husband, to stand up for your kids. And yet, often it could be the case I'm ashamed to stand up for Christ. And Paul said, I'm not ashamed. I'm bold. Why? What would give him such confidence to stand in the face of people who could throw him in jail, who could stone him to death? The multiple times he faced that, why was he so confident in the gospel? He says it. For it, that is the gospel, is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth. It's the power. I don't have to tell you the Greek word for power. Who can tell me what that is? Dynamite. It's dunamis. That's the Greek word. It's where you get the word dynamite. It is powerful. The gospel itself is powerful. It has a power. You think about this, in Rome, that was the center of power, was it not? For a whole empire, not just like a kingdom or a city, an empire. And he said, I'm not afraid to go to that place because the gospel has power, and it's got greater power than Rome has. Rome who built the roads, right? Rome who conquered the world. He said this, the gospel's, it's powerful enough to save those people. It is the power of God unto salvation. You know, a Calvinist once asked me, how can a dead man call on the Lord to save him? That's their argument for, because God doesn't want to save everybody because we're all dead. You can't call on the Lord and save him because you're dead. Oh, geez, what am I supposed to do? Well, God has to regenerate you first, which means you have to be chosen. Well, I don't know. The Apostle Paul said this, that the gospel is the power of God. As a dead man, dead in my sins, I heard the gospel. And you know what it did? It woke me up. And then I had a choice to make. Ooh, do I want to believe it? Do I want to trust in it? Or do I just want to keep walking, right? That's the choice. That's all. You and I, our only responsibility in this life is to do this. Give people the power of God and let them choose. Do you want it or not? He says this, man, it's the power of God. Listen to this. To everyone that believeth, to the Jew first and also to the Greek, for therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith. It's the power of God to everyone that believeth. There's not a person, I said this at the very beginning, there's not a person that cannot believe in the gospel. Everyone that believes, that's who it's for. Nobody's excluded. And as you begin to read, and we're going to start looking at this next week, the rest of this chapter, Paul goes on to prove that every one of us is guilty, and therefore every one of us needs to be saved. And every one of us then has to believe. If you want to be saved, you have to believe. That's the only way. Trust in Jesus Christ. And he says to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And it's in that, and I believe it's in this, in the truth that gospel is to everyone that believes, that very thing reveals God's righteousness. God is righteous in that he provided salvation to all who believe. Nobody can't get saved. God is fair. God's just. He's right. You and I would pick and choose who we want to go to heaven and who we don't. The people the lady that pulled out in front of me on my way to church tonight and almost ran into her, I would still pick her to go to heaven. But some of you guys wouldn't. But there's people, we are unjust, right? And right now I'm in a good mood, so I'd pick everybody. But what about when you're mad? You make decisions when you're mad. You say things that you would not say. You use words that you wouldn't say. God isn't like that. The Bible says he's just, he's fair. That word there, it has to do with his equality. The gospel is for everybody, to the Jew first, but it's also to the Greek. And so it's for all of us. And that's how you see that God is righteous, and he says it's from faith to faith. And I believe what he's talking about there's faith that gets you into Christ, that makes you saved, and then you live your life by the same faith. The just shall live by faith. And so as I look at this introduction here that Paul gives, and I saw 4 things that stood out to me about this letter that he's writing. He says this. 1, I wanted to go to you. I think Paul, if he could, he would have just gone and preached this to him. He wouldn't necessarily have written a letter. But God kept him, maybe so he'd write the letter, so we would have it. We've got this record. There's 16 chapters we're going to read, full of great truths. How many of you have ever opened a track and didn't see a verse from Romans in it? What do we call it? The Romans Road. Maybe God didn't let Paul go to Rome so that you and I could be reading this book a couple thousand years later. I think that's probably a good reason why. But his desire was to go to Rome. I'm thankful he didn't. His desire was to go to preach the gospel. As he writes this letter, he's going to write about the gospel. The gospel is the main message of this letter. It's about the gospel, the truth of the gospel, who the gospel's for, how you get into the gospel. He writes about the target of the gospel. We read it there in verse 14, verse 13, 14, and verse 16. It's for everybody. And then the way of receiving that gospel is by faith. It's to everyone that believeth. It's vitally important. As you read this letter, you're going to find that the word faith, which comes from the Greek word pistis, by the way, that word is used in at least 41 verses in the book of Romans. That's a lot. That's how many times just the word faith is used. And then the word believe comes from pistuo, which is from the same root as faith. It means to believe, and so it's to put your faith in something. It's to trust in it. That's used in 20 verses. And so that's 60 times he's talking about believing, put your faith in. That's a lot. And so when you talk about the gospel, you can't separate it from believing the gospel. There is no gospel without putting your faith in the gospel. The gospel is never preached without you being told you have to believe it. And that's it. There's times when the Bible mentions being saved and mentions being baptized. So people have put the two together. You got to be baptized to be saved. But how many times does God mention believing and being saved without being baptized? Baptism, to baptize is only used, I think, in 1 or 2 verses in the whole book. It's faith that's repeated again and again and again and again. He uses the word righteousness over 30 times in over 30 verses, righteousness. Once again, there's the righteousness of God, that he would offer salvation to us all, but there's also this: you and I have to be righteous. This idea that you can save yourself by being right, you're going to fall short. We need the righteousness of God, and how do we get it? By faith in Jesus Christ. And then there's also the word grace. Grace is used over 21 times. Grace is God giving it to us, not because we deserve it, but as we mentioned at the beginning, it's a gift. He just gives it to us. He just offers it to us freely. And so as we study the book of Romans, I hope we learn it the way that the Romans did, that it's all about salvation. Salvation is for everyone. It's all about placing your faith. And I believe, looking around this room, probably everyone in here has done that, or at least has a testimony that you have. And I'm really happy for that. I'm excited about that. But man, we've got a world around us that needs to hear that. That's the simple truth. There's a lot of messages that I think we want to tell people. Stop doing that. Quit acting like that. Stop, working on Sundays and go to church. Nobody's going to make that decision if they don't first put their faith in Jesus Christ, believe in the gospel. And it's hard sometimes to go and to preach. I believe Jonathan, he was telling me that he preached on Sunday about the Great Commission, and a big part of that, you don't have to know the Hebrew word for faith. What you have to know is, what did God do for you? Right? What did he do for me? He saved me. When I was a kid at camp, I heard the gospel that Jesus Christ died and rose again, and he did that as a perfect sacrifice to pay for my sins. And if I believe in him, I'd be saved. If I didn't believe in him, I was going to pay for my sins. I was going to die and go to hell. That's what I learned when I was a kid. And I thought, man, I don't want to do that. So somebody took me aside, and they showed me in the Bible, and we're going to read it later on in Romans chapter 10. It says, if thou believe in thine heart that God hath raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. So you know what I did? I have no idea what the words I used were. I could not tell you. But I believed that Jesus Christ died for me. I have believed it ever since. And by faith, I called on Christ, and he saved me. And you do the same. You probably have. That's what people need to hear. I'll tell you what, it's a lot easier when somebody asks you, hey, could you show me how to be saved? But I don't think a lot of people were asking Paul how to be saved. I think he was asking them, hey, you want to know how to be saved? And I think if that's a lot. If that's too much for you to do, if you don't feel comfortable doing that, at least do this. Hey, will you want to come to church with me? I know a lot of you do. People don't like to go to church because they're uncomfortable. You know why they're uncomfortable? Because they're sinners that need to be saved. And they're going to find out. But you know what? Invite them anyway. Bring them. Compel them. Go into the highways and hedges and compel them to come, because God said, I want my house to be full. All right, we're going to go ahead and pray, and we'll have a brief time of invitation, and then we'll have our business meeting. Heavenly Father, thank you for this evening, and thank you for your word. Thank you for the Apostle Paul, for the testimony that